The dusty Montana train station was alive with anticipation as the steam engine came to a halt. The year was 1885, and Clayton Hartwell stood tall on the wooden platform, holding the photograph of the delicate woman he had corresponded with for months. Eleanor Wade was supposed to be his future wife, sent to him through a mail-order bride service that promised companionship and a fresh start. He had hoped for a new life, one filled with warmth after the pain of losing his first wife, Mary, 5 years ago. His heart raced, his mind filled with visions of the life they would build together. The train doors creaked open with a sudden hiss of steam, and Clayton squinted into the crowd, waiting to see the woman who had captured his imagination through letters and photographs. The moment he saw her, though, everything in him froze. A woman stepped off the train, but it wasn't the fragile, soft-faced Eleanor he had expected. This woman was tall, too tall, at least 6 feet, and her face, instead of being delicate, was scarred, worn, and weathered. Her strong, muscular arms revealed a life spent working hard, not one of gentleness. Her eyes were intense, the weight of experience in them. Clayton's breath caught in his throat. A gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers, and whispers spread like wildfire. His heart sank as the realization set in. This was not the woman in the photograph. The silence was thick, oppressive, as the townsfolk stared in disbelief. The woman took a step forward, her boots scraping against the gravel. Clayton stood frozen, his hands still clutching the photograph, as if hoping that this strange woman would somehow turn back into the fragile, gentle image he had been sent. Her voice broke the silence. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume?" she asked, her tone steady, though there was a slight tremor in her words. Clayton's mind raced. "You're Eleanor Wade?" His voice was hesitant, a mix of disbelief and confusion. The woman nodded. "I'm Eleanor Wade, but the woman in your photograph, that's my sister, Sarah. She was supposed to come. She was supposed to be your bride." Her voice caught for a moment, and she glanced down at the ground before looking back up at him. "But she died of scarlet fever, Mr. Hartwell. I took her place. Your money's been spent, and I've nowhere else to go." Clayton stood, stunned, as the weight of her words settled on him. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, watching him, waiting to see what he would do. There was a long pause, the sound of the train's departure fading in the background. The townsfolk waited for Clayton to turn the woman away, to reject her and everything she had just said. It seemed like the only option, given the shock of her appearance. But something stopped him. He had been lonely for so long, and he wasn't sure if he could bear the thought of returning to that emptiness. Clayton swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. He looked at the woman before him, her tall frame, the scars that marked her face, the strength that seemed to radiate from her. Something in him shifted. He glanced at the photograph once more, then back to her. "I don't know what to say." His words came out slowly, as if he were waking from a long sleep. "But you've come all this way, and I'm not sending you back." His voice grew firmer. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, Mrs. Hartwell." The crowd gasped again. Whispers erupted, but Clayton didn't care. He moved forward and grabbed the large bag the woman carried, lifting it with ease despite its weight. She hesitated, but then, as if making a silent decision, she nodded and followed him. The two of them walked toward the wagon, the sound of the townspeople's murmurs following them like a heavy cloud. As they made their way out of the station, Clayton couldn't help but glance at her again. The woman who had come in place of his bride. What was she really like? What would happen next? And what had driven her to step into her sister's shoes? As the wagon creaked into motion, heading for his ranch, Clayton's mind swirled with questions that had no answers. The ride through the rugged Montana wilderness was silent, save for the occasional rattle of the wagon wheels against the dirt road. The tension between them was palpable, and Clayton felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity as he stole glances at her. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke up. "You said, "A man thought he owned you," he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "What do you mean by that?" The woman, Eleanor, glanced at him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice calm, almost detached. "He was a man who thought he could take everything from me. My body, my life, my choice." She paused, her eyes narrowing. He was wrong. Clayton was quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He looked at her scar, a jagged, angry line that ran from her chin to her neck, and wondered what kind of life she had led before she had come to him. But he didn't press further. Not yet. They finally arrived at the ranch, a two-story timber house that had been Clayton's home for years. He showed her to her room, but as she stepped inside, Eleanor's eyes darted to the lock on the inside of the door. Clayton noticed, and his throat tightened. He cleared his throat before speaking. "You can lock it if you feel the need," he said gently. "I don't force myself on anyone. Not now, not ever." Eleanor glanced at him, her face betraying no emotion. She didn't answer, but as Clayton left the room, he noticed that the bag she had carried, her only possession, was still packed and lying on the bed. He didn't know it yet, but Eleanor wasn't just running from the past. She was readying herself to leave again at any moment if she felt the need. As Clayton headed downstairs, he heard Silas, one of the ranch hands, speaking quietly to him. "You know, Mr. Hartwell," he said, his voice tinged with concern, "the town's already calling her the giant and Hartwell's monster." Clayton's jaw tightened. He didn't know what to say. Upstairs, Eleanor heard it too. She touched the scar on her face, her fingers lingering on the rough surface, and for a moment, she looked like a woman on the verge of running. But instead, she sat down on the bed, still as stone, and waited. The night stretched on, filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. Neither Clayton nor Eleanor knew exactly what was coming next. The sun had barely begun to rise when Eleanor was already awake, her eyes sharp as she observed the quiet ranch that surrounded her. She had made her decision the night before, and now, as she stepped out into the early morning chill, she found Clayton in the barn, working with the horses. Without hesitation, she approached him. "Put me to work. I don't take charity," she said, her voice steady, even though she knew he had not offered it. Clayton eyed her for a moment, then handed her an axe. "What needs chopping," he said, as if daring her to prove herself. Eleanor took the axe, and in a matter of minutes, she was splitting the wood with a strength that left Clayton staring in awe. Silas, who had been watching from a distance, whistled under his breath. "Stronger than half my ranch hands," he muttered, impressed. Clayton reevaluated his perception of her, his curiosity growing. Later that morning, Eleanor cooked a simple but hearty breakfast, the smell of sizzling bacon filling the air. Clayton sat at the table, his thoughts still racing over the woman who had shown up in place of his bride. "Why didn't you tell the truth in your letters?" he asked as she set a plate in front of him. Eleanor met his gaze, a quiet challenge in her eyes. "Would you have sent for me if I had?" she replied, and Clayton couldn't answer. It was a question that lingered in the air, unanswered. Later that day, the town's judgment came knocking at his door. Minister Hayes and a couple of the local women, including Mrs. Dalton and Mrs. Hawkins, arrived with concerned expressions, their eyes full of suspicion. They voiced their worries, accusing Clayton of being duped, questioning the legitimacy of his marriage to Eleanor. Eleanor stood tall, her posture unyielding. "We're legally married," she stated firmly. Mrs. Dalton's voice rose in protest, but Clayton cut her off. "My wife's business is my business." "Good day," he said, and with that, he slammed the door in their faces. For the first time, Eleanor felt something close to acceptance, and even a glimmer of unity between them. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor worked tirelessly on the ranch, proving herself invaluable. She mended fences, tended to the horses, and handled tasks with a skill that even the most seasoned ranch hands couldn't match. Her hard work didn't go unnoticed, but the town's judgment was far from over. A violent storm hit one night, and Clayton and Eleanor found themselves working side by side to secure the barn doors against the wind and rain. The horses were spooked, and the barn door was threatening to come off its hinges. They both rushed into the storm, working together to keep the animals safe. As Eleanor slipped in the mud, Clayton reached out to catch her, their hands touching for the first time. The world seemed to pause for a moment, and they locked eyes. There was an unspoken tension between them, something neither could name, but both felt deeply. When they finally made it back to the house, soaked and exhausted, Clayton made them both coffee. As they sat in silence, he finally spoke. "I'm not sending you back," he said quietly. Eleanor's voice was soft, but filled with the weight of everything she had been running from. "Why not?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for an answer. Clayton sighed, his gaze far away for a moment. "I lost my first wife, Mary, 5 years ago," he confessed. "She died in childbirth. The town treats me like I'm broken, like I'm glass. I wanted a fresh start, someone who didn't know my grief." He looked at Eleanor, his expression open. "We're both running from something," he added, and for the first time, Eleanor's walls cracked. She understood the pain he carried, and in that moment, something shifted between them. But just as the silence seemed to settle, she met his gaze and said softly, "There's something you should know about me, too." Her words hung in the air, and Clayton's curiosity deepened. What was she hiding? What had she been running from? The storm raged on, its fierce winds battering the house. But inside, the warmth of the hearth provided a strange comfort as Clayton and Eleanor sat in the kitchen, the room dimly lit by the flickering light of the fire. Eleanor's silence was thick, as if she were summoning the strength to reveal something she had kept hidden for years. Finally, she broke the quiet, her voice raw with emotion. "I suppose I owe you the truth," she said, her eyes distant as the words began to spill out. "Sarah, my sister, was everything to my father, his favorite. She was beautiful, kind, everything I was not. I was always too tall, too strong, too much for him." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "When Sarah got sick, father fell apart. The debts piled up, the bank started to threaten us with foreclosure, and it was all too much for him. Then Garrett, a neighbor, offered to pay the debts if I agreed to marry him." Eleanor's gaze hardened, the memory of the past still fresh in her mind. "I refused. I refused to be his, to give him what he wanted." Clayton could see the tension in her body, the deep pain that lingered in her words. But he didn't take kindly to my refusal. He came to the house one night, angry, demanding that I submit. He thought I was his property, that I had no right to say no. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, and Clayton could see the scar on her face as though it were branded into her very being. "He attacked me, and I fought back. I killed him, Clayton, with a kitchen knife." She looked at him, her eyes full of quiet desperation. The sheriff ruled it's self-defense, but the town never saw it that way. They called me a murderer, a monster. My father couldn't look at me, and Sarah, in her dying words, blamed me for everything. Clayton's heart ached as he listened to her story, her pain so raw and real that it felt as if she were reliving it in that very moment. "I took Sarah's place in that photograph because I thought it was the only way to escape, to redeem myself. I thought if I could be someone else, if I could disappear into her life, I might finally find peace." Eleanor paused, her voice faltering. "But that was a lie, too. I didn't think I could ever be enough for anyone, especially not someone like you." Clayton didn't know what to say at first. The silence between them was thick, but he finally broke it, his voice steady and firm. Did he deserve it? The question hung in the air, simple and blunt, but it was the only thing that seemed right to ask. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Yes," she said, her voice low but certain. "He did. He thought I was his to control, to own, and I wasn't. I wasn't anyone's." Clayton nodded, understanding more than she realized. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening. "Then you did what you had to," he said quietly. "I don't see a monster, Eleanor. I see a survivor." Her walls cracked then, her expression faltering as the weight of his words broke something inside her. She almost cried, but stopped herself, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm not good at being soft," she admitted, the words barely a whisper. "Then don't be," Clayton replied. "Be yourself." The moment passed, but something had changed between them. It wasn't just the weight of her past. It was the understanding that passed between them, a quiet connection that neither of them had expected. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor settled into life on the ranch. Her strength and skill became apparent with every task she undertook. She proved herself invaluable, and slowly but surely, the ranch hands began to respect her. Silas, who had been skeptical at first, even started looking out for her, a protective instinct developing in him that surprised Clayton. It wasn't long before Eleanor and Clayton began to slip into a rhythm. They worked together, shared meals, and had small conversations, comfortable silences, easy exchanges. But there was always a distance, a space between them, as though both were waiting for something before they could close the gap entirely. Their bedrooms remained separate, despite the unspoken connection between them. It was as though neither of them was ready to fully trust the other with their heart, with their past. On a Sunday, Clayton suggested they attend church together, their first public appearance as a married couple. Eleanor felt the weight of it immediately. As they entered the church, I turned to them. Whispers filled the air, and Clayton could feel the tension in the room. The women looked at Eleanor with suspicion, the men with disdain. The preacher, Reverend Hayes, began his sermon, and Clayton couldn't help but notice that his words seemed pointed, as if directed straight at Eleanor. "Deception in marriage," he said, his voice ringing through the church. "What happens when trust is broken, when lies fester in the heart of a relationship?" Eleanor's face remained stoic as she listened, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't flinch, though the judgment in the room was palpable. Clayton, however, could feel the anger rising in him. He wanted to stand up, to defend her, but he knew it would only make things worse. The service ended with the same cold stares and whispered gossip. As they left the church, Mrs. Dalton, one of the town's most prominent women, approached Eleanor with a false smile plastered on her face. "The ladies are having a tea this week," she said with a thin, almost patronizing tone, "for properly married women. I'm sure you'd be interested in joining us." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She knew what this was, another attempt to exclude her, to remind her that she was not welcome in their world. "I understand," Eleanor said quietly, turning to leave. But as she did, a drunk cowboy stepped into her path. "How much did Hartwell pay for damaged goods?" he sneered, reaching for her scar. "But he got a discount for that face." The word stung, but Eleanor's response was swift. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it with such force that he dropped to his knees in pain, his face contorted in shock. "Touch me again, and you'll lose that hand," she said, her voice cold as ice. The crowd around them fell silent, watching in awe and fear. Some of the men stepped back, wary of what she might do next. The women gasped, but no one said a word. Clayton arrived just in time to see the cowboy on his knees, Eleanor standing tall with her back straight, her expression calm but fierce. He walked over to her, his heart swelling with pride. "You didn't need me," he said, his voice soft, almost in admiration. Eleanor looked at him, her face hard but something softer in her eyes. "Never have," she replied, her tone strong yet gentle. They stood there for a moment, just the two of them, before Clayton took her hand. Together, they walked back to the ranch in silence. But it was a comfortable silence, one filled with understanding. As they approached the house, Eleanor's face changed. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw a rider approaching in the distance, a well-dressed man on a black horse. Her face went white. "No," she whispered under her breath. "It can't be." Clayton turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Who is that?" he asked. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, filled with dread. "Garrett's brother, Marcus." Clayton's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man and what did he want? What did he do to them? The storm, it seemed, was far from over. And as the rider drew closer, the fear in Eleanor's eyes told Clayton that they were about to face something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The wind was harsh against the ranch as Clayton and Eleanor stood together, the distant sound of hooves growing louder in the cold morning air. Eleanor's face had gone pale as she saw the figure riding toward them. Clayton followed her gaze and saw the man on a black horse, his dark eyes and stern face cutting through the distance like a shadow. As he drew nearer, the man dismounted, his boots landing with a solid thud on the ground. Clayton's hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, but he didn't pull it out. The man's presence was cold, calculating. He was the last person Clayton wanted to meet, and Eleanor, too, seemed frozen, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. The man's voice was smooth, almost mocking, as he greeted them. "Mrs. Wade, or should I say Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his gaze sharp as it flicked between the two. Eleanor straightened, her shoulders stiff with tension. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm, though her hand was trembling slightly. The man's lips twisted into a thin smile, and he took a step closer. "I'm Marcus Garrett," he said, his tone dripping with venom, "and I've come to collect." Clayton's brow furrowed, his mind racing. "Collect what?" he demanded, his voice rising with suspicion. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Garrett family owned your father-in-law's land. Now I own it," he said with cold satisfaction. "I have the deed in my pocket, and I have every intention of taking what's mine." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as Marcus held out a crumpled piece of paper. Clayton's hands clenched into fists. He was used to dealing with ranch problems, but this was something else. Marcus's smile didn't falter. "You've been hiding her for too long, Hartwell. You've got no claim on her. I've come for justice for my brother." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her fists clenched, but she stepped in front of Clayton, a protective instinct rising within her. "You can't take me back," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've got no legal right." Marcus, however, was far from moved. He looked down at her, like she was an object, his gaze cold. "I've got more than just legal rights, Mrs. Hartwell," he sneered. "I've got the law on my side, and I've got witnesses who'll say she's a murderer. I'm taking her back, whether you like it or not." Clayton's blood boiled. "She's my wife. She stays here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You can't take her." Marcus's eyes flickered with anger. "A marriage built on lies can be annulled," he spat. "She's a murderess. She should hang." Clayton took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "No, she shouldn't," he said firmly, looking Marcus dead in the eyes. "I know what you did, and I don't care what your witnesses say. You're not taking her anywhere." Marcus's lip curled into a sneer. "You're making a big mistake, Hartwell." He reached for the gun at his side, but Clayton's hand was already on his rifle. "You won't make it far," Clayton warned. Marcus scoffed, taking a step back. "I'll be back in 3 days, Hartwell," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "And when I return, I'll bring the territorial marshal with me. Your wife will stand trial for what she did. You can't protect her forever." With a final, venomous look, Marcus mounted his horse and rode off, disappearing into the distance as Clayton and Eleanor stood in the bitter cold, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on their shoulders. Eleanor was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "I have to run," she said quietly, as if the words were barely escaping her lips. Clayton turned to her, his eyes full of determination. "No," he said firmly. "You're not going anywhere." He stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. "We'll fight this. We'll fight for you." Eleanor shook her head, her voice trembling. "He'll destroy you, Clayton. He'll take everything you've built. Your ranch, everything." Clayton's grip tightened on her shoulders. "Let him try," he said. "I'm not backing down. I'm not letting him take you." Eleanor looked at him, her heart torn. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you fighting for me?" Clayton's eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed himself to speak the truth. "Because you're my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And he stopped, his words faltering. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable like this before. But with Eleanor, it was different. She was different. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked as though she were going to break. "I'm not worth this," she whispered, her voice breaking. Clayton pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You are to me," he said softly. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe them. They were in this together. The weight of their past still loomed over them, but together they were stronger. They could face whatever was coming. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and uncertainty. Silas, seeing the growing threat from Marcus, suggested that they fight him in the court of public opinion first, before the territorial marshal arrived. "Get the town on your side," Silas said, his tone serious, "before Marcus has a chance to twist their minds." Clayton was skeptical. "The town hates her," he said, his voice dark with the knowledge of how people had treated Eleanor. "They don't care about her. They fear her." Silas's expression softened. "They fear her, yes," he said, "but that's different from hatred. If you can show them who she really is, show them the truth, they'll see her for what she is. Not a monster, but a woman who has survived more than they could ever understand." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she listened to Silas's words. "I don't know how to be liked," she said quietly, her voice full of doubt. Clayton stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then show them that you're useful," he said. "Show them that you're strong." Eleanor didn't say anything, but she understood. She had always been strong, even when the world had tried to break her. Now, it was time to show the town that they had underestimated her. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor worked tirelessly, helping out the neighbors in secret. She mended Widow Porter's fence overnight, patched up the doctor's sick horse, and even restocked the schoolhouse woodpile. The town took notice, but they didn't know who was behind it. Silas quietly spread the word, whispering to anyone who would listen. "That's Mrs. Hartwell's work." It wasn't long before the whispers turned into something more. When Marcus returned, 3 days later, he brought with him the territorial marshal, a man who had a reputation for getting things done. The emergency town meeting was called, and every man, woman, and child in Copper Ridge gathered in the church, murmuring anxiously. Marcus stood at the front, presenting his evidence, a group of witnesses who claimed that Eleanor had seduced his brother Garrett before killing him in cold blood. The crowd listened in silence, the air thick with tension. The marshal stepped forward and asked, "Does anyone here know this woman? Testify. Speak for her." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, to everyone's surprise, Silas stood. "I know her," he said, his voice steady and clear. "She works harder than any man I've seen. Honest. Fair." Mrs. Porter, the widow who had been helped in secret, stood next. "Someone mended my fence this week. Didn't ask for thanks or payment," she said. One by one, the townspeople stood, each offering a piece of their truth, their voices rising in Eleanor's defense. Even the town doctor stood, speaking of the injuries he had seen on Eleanor when she first arrived. Old injuries, broken ribs, burned scars. Evidence of prolonged abuse, he said. Whatever she did was survival. Clayton stood before the crowd, his voice strong. "Yes, she deceived me," he said, his eyes locked on the crowd. Eleanor's face fell as she heard the words, but Clayton didn't hesitate. "She let me believe she needed saving," he said. "But she didn't. She saved herself. Then she saved me from loneliness." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "So yes, she lied about a photograph," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "And I got something far better than I deserved." The marshal, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally stepped forward. He reviewed the original sheriff's report, confirming that the self-defense ruling still stood. There was no new evidence to overturn it. Mrs. Hartwell is free, the marshal declared, his voice firm and final. Marcus, enraged, shouted in protest. This isn't over. But the marshal didn't flinch. Yes, it is. Leave these people alone. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor and Clayton walked home together, their hands entwined, a sense of relief finally settling between them. For the first time, the fear that had held Eleanor captive for so long began to fade. She was safe, and together they had won. But as they walked into the house, Eleanor looked out the window and saw Marcus still watching from the treeline. The storm was far from over. 3 days passed in uneasy silence, the air thick with the aftershock of Marcus's threat. And though Eleanor and Clayton tried to return to some semblance of normality, neither could shake the feeling that they were still waiting for something, some final blow to shatter the fragile peace they had fought so hard to create. Eleanor was stronger now, more confident, and the ranch, once cold and silent, was filled with a sense of purpose. The apple trees Clayton had planted months ago had begun to bud, and the quiet rhythm of their daily routines was a comfort. But Clayton could see that the storm had not entirely passed for Eleanor. She was too quiet at times, her thoughts seemingly far away, and he knew she was still haunted by the past she couldn't escape, by the man who had tried to take everything from her. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the mountains, Eleanor was alone in the barn, tending to the horses. Clayton was inside the house, watching the fire flicker, when he heard the sound of a horse's hooves approaching. His heart clenched, his instinct flaring. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, his eyes scanning the horizon, but all he saw was the shape of a man emerging from the shadows. Marcus Garrett. Clayton's blood ran cold. Did you really think I'd let you in? Marcus's voice was low, menacing. You think you can take what's mine, Hartwell? You think you can hide her away like some trophy? Clayton stepped forward, the rifle still in his hands, his grip firm. You're not welcome here, Marcus, he said, his voice steady. You need to leave. Now. Marcus sneered, his eyes flashing with hatred. Not without her. He spat, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. Clayton's heart pounded in his chest as Marcus lunged forward, his knife glinting in the low light. But Eleanor was faster. She had heard the commotion and had rushed to the barn, where she saw Marcus with his knife drawn, aiming it at Clayton. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby pitchfork, her muscles coiled with the same survival instinct that had kept her alive all these years. She lunged, pushing Marcus off balance, and he staggered back, but he was quick to recover. You think you can stop me? He sneered, taking a step toward her. I'm going to make sure you regret ever crossing me, you monster. Eleanor stood her ground, her breath coming in shallow bursts, but her resolve was unshakable. You won't touch me again, she said, her voice icy. She took a step forward, and before Marcus could react, she thrust the pitchfork at him, knocking him backward. The sound of metal clashing with flesh was deafening, and the force of the blow sent Marcus crashing to the ground. But even as she stood there, triumphant, Eleanor's heart raced, her hands trembling. She had never wanted to kill again, never wanted to let the rage that had once consumed her take over. But this was different. This was survival. Get up. Eleanor spat, her voice trembling with raw emotion. You're nothing. Marcus slowly got to his feet, a murderous glint in his eye. You won't win, he growled, his voice low with fury. You can't hide from me. I'll make sure you regret it. But as he took another step toward her, Clayton's voice rang out, firm and commanding. Enough. Clayton stepped between them, his rifle trained on Marcus. You've got no claim here. You've lost, Marcus. You're done. Marcus froze, his eyes flicking from Clayton's gun to Eleanor's unwavering stance. For a moment, it seemed as though he might try to run, but he didn't. He just stood there, defeated, knowing that he had lost the battle. I'll be back, he said, his voice laced with venom, but it was no longer a threat. It was a whisper, a hollow promise. Clayton's jaw tightened as he aimed his rifle at the ground. "No, you won't," he said. "You're done here." The sound of the rifle shot echoed through the still night air, the bullet hitting the dirt in front of Marcus, sending a clear message. Marcus didn't move, his eyes wide with fear and humiliation. Slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark night, his presence no longer a threat. Clayton's heart pounded as he lowered the rifle. He turned to Eleanor, his eyes softening. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with relief. But Eleanor's face was pale, her hands shaking as she dropped the pitchfork. She collapsed into Clayton's arms, the tension of the past few days finally breaking. She had won, but the victory felt hollow in her chest, as if the fight had cost her more than she was willing to give. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to become that person again." Clayton held her tightly, his heart aching for her. "You didn't become anything," he said softly. "You protected us. You protected me." He kissed the top of her head, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. "You're safe now. We're safe now." The sound of hooves faded into the distance, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. But for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. The darkness that had consumed her for so long was fading, and with Clayton by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. As they stood there in the quiet, the warmth of the house behind them offering a sense of comfort, Eleanor allowed herself to lean into Clayton, feeling his steady presence, his strength. It was the first time she had truly felt safe in years. "It's over," she repeated softly, the words finally feeling like they belonged. Clayton didn't answer right away. He just held her, his arms strong around her, grounding her in the moment. And as they stood there, the storm finally passing, the ranch that had once felt so cold and distant now felt like home. "It's over," he whispered back, his voice full of the promise of a future they would build together. The sound of their footsteps as they walked back to the house was soft and steady, the beginning of something new. Eleanor had fought for her survival, but now, with Clayton, she had found something worth fighting for. As they entered the house, the fire still crackling in the hearth, they knew that the future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Together, the days following the confrontation with Marcus passed slowly, and though Eleanor tried to find solace in the quiet rhythms of daily life, the weight of everything that had happened, the danger, the fear, and the fight for her survival, still clung to her. As much as she wanted to move forward, there was a deep ache in her chest, a gnawing emptiness that couldn't be filled by work, by silence, or by the newfound safety she had with Clayton. She had lived so long in fear, so long running from the ghosts of her past, that now, when the storm seemed to have passed, it felt as though there was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the next threat. Wait for the next betrayal. Wait for the next loss. But Clayton wouldn't let her fall back into that cycle of fear. Every time Eleanor tried to withdraw, he was there, steady and strong, pulling her back, reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore. He never pushed her to talk about the things that haunted her. He simply let her be, offering comfort in his presence, in the steady pace of their lives together. Yet, as the weeks went by, something inside Eleanor began to shift. The small, steady things that had once seemed so out of reach. Comfort, safety, love became real to her. There were no more secrets between them. She had told him everything, every lie, every painful truth, every battle she had fought and won in silence. And in return, Clayton had shared his own heartache, his own loss. The two of them, broken and bruised in their own ways, had found a way to heal, not just as individuals, but as a couple. It was early spring when Eleanor first noticed a change. She had been out in the orchard, hands in the soil, feeling the warmth of the sun on her back, when she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and glanced over at Clayton, who was working nearby. He had always been the quieter of the two, a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Every day he showed up. Every day he was there with her, standing side by side, building something. Together. The thought made Eleanor smile, a small, private thing that she quickly hid behind her hair as she returned to her work. The joy she found in these simple moments, the way the sunlight felt warm on her skin, the way the soil smelled sweet with new life, was something she never thought she would experience again. It wasn't just about the ranch. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about being with Clayton, about trusting him, about trusting herself. And then, one afternoon, as they worked side by side in the orchard, Clayton's voice broke the silence. "Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone serious. She stopped what she was doing and turned to face him, her heart skipping in her chest. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern threading through her voice. Clayton's expression softened, and he took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. "Nothing's wrong," he said, his voice steady. He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I've been thinking about the future, about what comes next for us. And I know I've been scared to really talk about it, but Eleanor, I want you to know that you're not just my wife. You're my partner. You're everything." His words, simple as they were, held so much weight. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, trying to steady her breathing. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Clayton continued, his hand reaching for hers. "I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you. And he stopped again, his voice catching slightly. "I want to build a life with you. A real life. Together." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't speak for a moment. She had never expected this, never expected him to love her in the way he did. After everything, after all the pain, all the loss, to hear him say those words, to know that he was truly here for her, it was more than she had ever dreamed of. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers trembling as she wiped away the tear that had slipped from his eye. "I never thought I could have this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could have something like this. With you." Clayton smiled softly, his hand finding hers again. "Well, you've got it now," he said gently. "And I'm not going anywhere." They stood there for a moment, their hands entwined, their hearts beating in the same rhythm. For the first time in Eleanor's life, she felt truly seen, truly loved. She didn't need to hide anymore. She didn't need to run. And then, a few days later, everything changed again. Eleanor woke up one morning feeling strange, dizzy, nauseous. She tried to brush it off, but the feeling didn't pass. She made her way to the kitchen, where Clayton was already up, and he looked at her with concern when he saw the way she was holding her stomach. "You don't look so good," he said gently. "Are you feeling okay?" Eleanor shook her head, still trying to shake off the dizziness. "I don't know," she admitted. I feel off." Clayton's concern deepened, and without another word, he placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her to sit at the table. "You've been working too hard," he said softly. "You need to rest." Eleanor nodded, but there was something nagging at the back of her mind. A thought, a realization that she didn't want to believe. But as the day wore on, it became clearer. The nausea didn't fade. And then, that evening, when she went to the well to draw water, her hands trembled as she placed her hand on her stomach. It hit her in that moment, the faint, fluttering feeling she'd been ignoring. She was pregnant. A surge of emotion rose in her chest, and for a moment, she just stood there, her hand on her belly, staring out across the land. She was pregnant. She felt a mixture of fear and joy. After all they had been through, after the battles they had fought, she was carrying a piece of their future. She had never thought she would have a family. She had never thought she would have a child. Certainly not after everything that had happened. But now, with Clayton by her side, she knew that they could face whatever came next. They could do this. She could do this. When Clayton came to join her, She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her eyes. "Eleanor," he asked, his voice tentative. She smiled, a wide, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "We're going to have a baby, Clayton," she said, her voice full of wonder. Clayton's face transformed in an instant, his eyes lighting up with joy. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "You're sure?" Eleanor nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I'm sure." Clayton pulled her into his arms, his hands shaking as he held her tightly. "I can't believe it," he whispered. "We're going to have a family." The world seemed to stand still for a moment, and in that stillness, Eleanor realized that this was what she had been fighting for. This was the life she had never dared to dream of. And now it was happening. The next few weeks passed quickly as they adjusted to the news. Clayton was beside her every step of the way, his excitement infectious as they prepared for the arrival of their child. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something real, something lasting. They were creating a future together. And for Eleanor, that future no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt real. It felt possible. The day of the birth came quietly, just as the sun was beginning to rise. Clayton paced nervously outside as the midwife and Mrs. Dalton arrived, preparing for the long hours ahead. Eleanor's labor was intense, and the hours seemed to stretch on forever. But through it all, she held on to the one thought that kept her grounded. Clayton was here. He never left her side. When the baby finally arrived, it was just as Eleanor had hoped, healthy, strong, and full of life. Clayton held their daughter in his arms, his face filled with wonder as he looked down at her. "What should we name her?" he asked softly. Eleanor smiled through her exhaustion. "Sarah," she whispered, "after my sister." Clayton looked at her, his heart full. "She'll be strong like you," he said, tears in his eyes. As they settled into their new life, the ranch became a place of peace and love. It was their home, built from the ground up, and it was theirs. Together, they were building something that would last, something that no one, not even the ghosts of their pasts, could take away. Eleanor stood with Clayton by the apple trees, their daughter in her arms, as the trees blossomed around them. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, it didn't matter. They had everything they needed, and together, they could face whatever came next.